It was a perfect day, the kind that made the world feel alive with possibility. The sun shone brightly in a cloudless sky, its golden rays warming the earth and casting a shimmering glow over the meadow that stretched beyond the little cottage. A soft breeze rustled through the tall grass, carrying the sweet scent of wildflowers and the distant hum of bees hard at work. For Max, the young puppy who had only recently begun to explore this vast and colorful world, the day felt like an adventure waiting to happen. Max was a bundle of energy wrapped in soft golden fur. His floppy ears bounced with every bound he made, and his dark, curious eyes sparkled with mischief. He loved the meadow, with its endless hiding spots, fluttering insects, and tall grasses that swayed like waves in the wind. Every day was an opportunity to uncover something new, to chase after things that moved, and to leap after things that didn't. He was, after all, a puppy, a creature ruled by the whims of curiosity and the thrill of discovery. This particular morning, Max had been up with the first light of dawn. He had woken Emma, his favorite human, by jumping on her bed and licking her face until she laughed and pushed him off. Emma was only 8 years old, with an endless supply of patience for Max's antics. She adored him, and the feeling was mutual. After breakfast, Max had begged to be let outside, pawing at the door and whining until Emma's father, Tom, opened it with a chuckle. "Go on, then," Tom said, watching as Max bolted out into the open field. "Don't get into too much trouble." Max had no plans for trouble. Of course, trouble just had a way of finding him. He spent the first hour dashing back and forth, chasing after a rabbit that was far too quick for him. Then he discovered a puddle near the edge of the meadow and spent a good while splashing in it until his fur was damp and muddy. Emma had come out briefly to play with him, tossing a ball that he dutifully retrieved until a shiny beetle distracted him. She laughed and left him to his own devices, calling out, "Be good, Max," as she returned to the house. The hours passed in blissful exploration. Max sniffed every patch of grass, dug shallow holes with his tiny paws, and barked at a flock of birds that took off in unison, their wings beating the air with a sound like applause. It was as if the meadow was applauding him for his unrelenting energy. Eventually, Max flopped down under the shade of a large oak tree, his pink tongue lolling out as he caught his breath. The world seemed so big and inviting, and for a moment, he simply enjoyed the sensation of the soft grass beneath him and the warm breeze ruffling his fur. That was when he saw it, the butterfly. It wasn't just any butterfly. This one was different. Its wings were a dazzling shade of blue, so vibrant that they seemed to shimmer with their own light. Max had seen plenty of butterflies before, but none like this. It floated just above the grass, its delicate wings moving lazily, as if it had all the time in the world. Max tilted his head, fascinated. His tiredness vanished in an instant, replaced by a bubbling excitement. The butterfly drifted closer, and Max pounced. He didn't come close to catching it, of course. It flitted upward with a grace that made him bark in frustration. The chase was on. Max bounded after the butterfly, his paws pounding against the ground, his tail wagging furiously. He leaped into the air, snapping playfully at the elusive creature, but it always stayed just out of reach, as if taunting him. The butterfly led him farther and farther away from the familiar parts of the meadow. Max didn't notice. His world had shrunk to include only himself and the butterfly. He barely registered the shift in scenery as the tall grasses gave way to denser undergrowth. The sunlight grew dimmer as the trees loomed closer together, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. The air here was cooler, carrying a faint, earthy smell that tickled Max's nose. The butterfly finally disappeared into a hollow tree, its blue wings vanishing into darkness. Max skidded to a halt, panting heavily. He stared at the tree, waiting to see if it would come back out. When it didn't, he let out a soft whine, pawing at the bark as if to coax it back into view. But the butterfly was gone. Max looked around, his excitement slowly giving way to confusion. The forest was quiet, too quiet. There were no cheerful bird songs here, no rustling of grass in the wind. The shadows were long and deep, and the trees stood like silent sentinels, their trunks gnarled and ancient. Max's ears twitched as he strained to pick up a familiar sound, but all he heard was the distant creak of a tree branch. A flicker of unease crept into his chest. Where was the meadow? Where was the sunshine? Max took a hesitant step back, his paws crunching on a bed of dry leaves. He let out a tentative bark, hoping Emma or Tom would hear him and come running. But his voice seemed to be swallowed up by the forest, the sound fading into the stillness. Max sniffed the air, trying to catch a familiar scent, but everything here smelled strange. He turned in circles, his tail tucked low, unsure of which direction to go. For the first time in his short life, Max felt truly alone. And then, from somewhere close by, a soft hiss broke the silence. Max froze, his ears pricking up as the soft hiss reached him. It was unlike any sound he'd heard before. Sharp, deliberate, and unnervingly close. His body stiffened, his playful energy now replaced by a nervous tension. Slowly, he turned his head, scanning the shadows for the source of the sound. The forest, which had already felt eerie, now seemed to close in around him. The trees loomed taller, their twisted branches like skeletal hands reaching out. The ground beneath his paws felt colder. The hiss came again, louder this time, and Max's eyes locked onto something in the underbrush. At first, it looked like just another stick, lying coiled among the fallen leaves. But then it moved. The stick shifted, its shiny black surface catching the faint light filtering through the canopy. Two piercing yellow eyes glared at Max, unblinking and filled with an almost otherworldly menace. The stick raised its head, its long body tensing as it prepared to strike. Max let out a hesitant bark, unsure if this strange creature was friend or foe. To him, it looked odd and new, something that might be fun to chase or chew on. But the snake wasn't playing. It let out a sharp, warning rattle, the tip of its tail vibrating furiously. The sound sent a shiver down Max's spine, though his puppyish curiosity refused to let him back away completely. He took a cautious step closer, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. The snake reacted instantly, lunging forward with lightning speed. Max yelped in surprise, jumping back just in time to avoid the snap of its jaws. His heart raced as he realized the creature wasn't just a new playmate, it was dangerous. The snake reared back, its body coiling tightly as it prepared for another strike. Max barked again, this time in fear, his voice echoing through the forest. He backed up a few steps, his instincts finally warning him to run. But before he could turn, the snake sprang into action. It lunged not to bite, but to wrap itself around him. Max barely had time to react. In one swift motion, the snake's powerful body coiled around him, pinning his legs and trapping his small frame. The sensation was unlike anything Max had ever felt. Tight, suffocating, and unrelenting. He wriggled desperately, his tiny paws scrabbling against the snake's smooth scales. But the more he struggled, the tighter the coils became. The snake's grip squeezed the air from Max's lungs, and his frantic yelps turned into soft, panicked whimpers. His mind raced with confusion and fear. Why was this happening? What had he done to provoke such a terrifying creature? He tried to remember the safety of the meadow, the warmth of the sun on his fur, and Emma's laugh as she tossed him the ball earlier that day. Those memories now felt like a lifetime ago. Back at the cottage, Emma was sitting by the window, watching the meadow with a worried expression. She had noticed Max's absence a while ago, but she'd assumed he was chasing a rabbit or napping under his favorite oak tree. Now, as the shadows grew longer and the meadow seemed quieter than usual, unease began to creep into her chest. "Dad," she called out, turning to where Tom was fixing a broken fence. "Have you seen Max? He's been gone a long time." Tom straightened, brushing dirt off his hands. He glanced toward the meadow, his brow furrowing. "I thought he was out here with you." Emma shook her head, her worry deepening. "He was earlier, but I haven't seen him in a while. What if he got lost?" Tom sighed, setting down his tools. "He's probably chasing something and lost track of time. You know how he is. But just to be safe, let's go look for him." Grabbing a flashlight and a walking stick, Tom led the way as Emma followed close behind. Together, they called out Max's name, their voices carrying across the meadow and into the woods. At first, there was no response, only the distant rustling of leaves in the breeze. But then, faintly, Emma thought she heard something, a high-pitched yelp that sent a chill down her spine. "Did you hear that?" she asked, clutching Tom's sleeve. Tom nodded, his expression now serious. "It came from the woods. Let's hurry." Meanwhile, Max's struggles were growing weaker. The snake's coils pressed harder against him, making it almost impossible to breathe. His small chest heaved as he tried to gulp in air, his vision blurring with panic. The snake's yellow eyes watched him intently, its head swaying slightly as it tightened its grip. To the snake, Max was an intruder, a threat to its nest, and it was determined to eliminate him. But Max wasn't ready to give up. Summoning the last of his strength, he twisted and kicked, managing to loosen the coils around his hind legs. He let out another desperate bark, hoping against hope that anyone, would hear him. The bark reached Emma and Tom just as they entered the forest. Emma broke into a run, her heart pounding. "Max, we're coming," she shouted, her voice trembling. Tom shone the flashlight ahead, the beam cutting through the dimness. The forest felt darker and more foreboding than ever, each shadow seeming to hold hidden dangers. Emma tripped over a root but quickly got back up, her determination pushing her forward. As they drew closer to the source of the sound, the snake seemed to sense the disturbance. Its head whipped around, its eyes narrowing as it heard the distant voices. It paused, momentarily distracted, and that was all Max needed. With one final, desperate effort, he wriggled free of the snake's loosened grip, tumbling to the ground in a heap. The snake, now furious, lashed out at him again, but Max scrambled away, his legs shaking beneath him. He let out another weak bark, his voice hoarse but defiant. This time, it was loud enough to guide Emma and Tom directly to him. When they arrived, the sight before them made Emma gasp. There, in a small clearing, stood Max, his fur matted and dirty, his breaths coming in ragged pants. A large snake loomed nearby, its body coiled and ready to strike again. Emma didn't hesitate. She rushed forward, scooping Max into her arms as Tom brandished the stick, swinging it to keep the snake at bay. "Stay back!" Tom shouted, his voice firm. The snake hesitated, its unblinking eyes fixed on the intruders. Finally, with a low hiss, it slithered back into the underbrush, disappearing into the shadows from which it had come. Emma held Max tightly, tears streaming down her face. "It's okay, Max," she whispered. "We've got you. You're safe now." Max let out a soft whine, burying his face against her chest as his trembling began to subside. But as they made their way out of the forest, Emma couldn't shake the feeling of how close they had come to losing him. The woods, once a place of curiosity and adventure, now felt like a reminder of how fragile and precious life truly was. Emma cradled Max in her arms, her hands trembling as she felt his small body shake with exhaustion. His fur was damp and matted, and every shallow breath he took seemed to cost him a monumental effort. Her heart ached as she looked into his tired, dark eyes, which seemed to plead for comfort and safety. She whispered soothing words, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her own heart. Tom walked briskly ahead, clearing the path with his flashlight and stick, glancing back every few steps to make sure Emma was keeping up. The forest, now cloaked in shadow as the evening crept closer, felt more menacing than ever. Each rustling leaf and snapping twig made Emma flinch. The image of the snake, its cold, unblinking eyes and powerful coils, was seared into her mind. She couldn't shake the fear that it, or something worse, might reappear at any moment. "Are you okay back there?" Tom asked, his voice firm but laced with concern. Emma nodded, though her voice trembled when she replied, "He's so cold, Dad. And he's not wagging his tail. He always wags his tail." Tom's jaw tightened. He didn't want to scare Emma, but he knew time was critical. "We'll get him to Dr. Harper. She'll know what to do. Just keep holding him close." Max stirred weakly in Emma's arms, letting out a soft, pitiful whine. She hugged him tighter, whispering, "It's okay, Max. You're gonna be fine. You're the bravest puppy in the whole world." The walk back to the meadow felt endless. Every step seemed heavier than the last, and Emma's arms ached from holding Max, but she refused to let him go. She was determined to protect him, no matter what. As they finally emerged from the forest and into the open meadow, the last rays of sunlight bathed the grass in a soft golden light. It was a stark contrast to the fear and tension Emma felt in her chest. Tom picked up his pace as they neared the cottage, where the family's old truck was parked. "Get in," he said, opening the passenger door for Emma. She climbed in carefully, still clutching Max, while Tom started the engine. The truck rumbled to life, and they sped off down the narrow dirt road toward the veterinary clinic. The ride was tense and quiet except for Max's occasional whimpers and Emma's soft reassurances. Tom's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The clinic was a good 15-minute drive away, but it felt like an eternity. Emma kept glancing down at Max, searching for any sign of improvement. "Come on, Max," she whispered. "Just wag your tail for me." "Just a little?" Max's ears twitched slightly, and he let out a low whine. It wasn't much, but it gave Emma a flicker of hope. When they finally arrived at the clinic, Tom pulled up to the front entrance and jumped out to open the door for Emma. She rushed inside, holding Max tightly. The waiting area was empty except for the receptionist, who looked up in alarm as Emma hurried toward the counter. "Please help him," Emma cried, her voice breaking. "He's hurt, and he can't breathe right." The receptionist quickly called for Dr. Harper, who appeared moments later in her white coat, her face calm but focused. "Bring him here," she said, guiding Emma into an examination room. Tom followed close behind, his expression grim. Dr. Harper took Max from Emma's arms and placed him gently on the examination table. "What happened?" she asked as she began checking his vitals, her hands moving with practiced precision. "A snake," Tom replied. It wrapped around him and squeezed. "He got away, but he's been struggling to breathe." Dr. Harper frowned, but didn't pause in her work. She listened to Max's chest with a stethoscope, examined his limbs, and checked his eyes and gums. "He's in shock," she said after a moment. "His breathing is shallow, and his heart rate is irregular. He's also dehydrated." Emma stood frozen by the table, her hands clasped tightly together. "Can you save him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Harper met her eyes, her expression both kind and serious. "We'll do everything we can." She moved quickly, hooking Max up to and forward to deliver fluids and medication to stabilize him. She placed a small oxygen mask over his nose and mouth, explaining that it would help him breathe. Emma watched anxiously, every second feeling like an hour. Tom rested a reassuring hand on her shoulder, though his own worry was written plainly across his face. As the minutes ticked by, Max began to relax slightly. His breathing, though still labored, grew more regular. Dr. Harper gave him a light sedative to ease his discomfort and stepped back to let him rest. "He's stable for now," she said, turning to Emma and Tom, "but he's not out of danger yet. The next few hours are critical. If his condition improves, he should make a full recovery. But if not," she didn't finish the sentence, but Emma understood. The weight of the unspoken words pressed heavily on her chest. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Can I stay with him?" she asked. Dr. Harper smiled gently. "Of course." Emma pulled up a chair beside Max's table, her small hand resting on his paw. His fur felt soft but cold, and she rubbed it gently, trying to warm him. "You're going to be okay, Max," she whispered. "You have to be. You're my best friend." Tom stepped out to call Emma's mother and let her know what was happening, leaving Emma alone with Max. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the oxygen machine and the faint beep of the heart monitor. Emma stayed by Max's side, refusing to leave even as the hours dragged on. At one point, Max stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open for just a moment. Emma gasped, her heart leaping with hope. "Max, can you hear me?" His tail gave the faintest of wags before he drifted back into sleep. It was a small gesture, but to Emma, it meant everything. She smiled through her tears, holding on to that tiny sign of life with all her heart. The night stretched on, filled with moments of hope and worry. But Emma never let go of Max's paw, determined to be there for him no matter what. The first rays of dawn filtered through the windows of the veterinary clinic, casting a soft, golden light over the room where Emma sat beside Max. She hadn't moved from her spot all night, her small hand resting gently on his paw. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying, but she refused to let exhaustion pull her away. Every rise and fall of Max's tiny chest was a reminder that he was still fighting. Dr. Harper entered quietly, holding a clipboard and a cup of coffee. She paused when she saw Emma slumped in her chair, her head nodding forward with fatigue. The veterinarian approached and gently placed a hand on Emma's shoulder, startling her awake. "You've been here all night," Dr. Harper said softly. "Why don't you rest for a bit? I'll keep an eye on him." Emma shook her head, her voice hoarse but resolute. "I can't leave him. He needs me." Dr. Harper smiled warmly, admiring the girl's devotion. "Max is lucky to have you. He's been stable through the night, which is a good sign. But we'll need to watch him closely for the next few hours." Emma glanced down at Max, her heart lifting slightly. He was still hooked up to the oxygen machine, his small body barely moving, but his breathing seemed a little easier. His fur, though still damp in places, had regained some of its golden sheen. She reached out to stroke his head, whispering words of encouragement. "You're doing so good, Max. You're the bravest puppy ever. Just keep trying, okay? You're gonna come home with me." Tom entered the room a moment later, carrying a bag of food and a thermos. He looked as tired as Emma, his face lined with worry, but he tried to offer her a reassuring smile. "Brought you some breakfast," he said, setting the bag on a nearby table. "Thought you could use it." Emma shook her head again, her focus entirely on Max. "I'm not hungry." Tom sighed, sitting down in the chair next to her. "You need to eat, sweetheart. Max wouldn't want you to get sick worrying about him." Emma hesitated, then reached for the thermos. The warm smell of hot cocoa wafted up as she unscrewed the lid. She took a small sip, the sweetness comforting her a little. "Do you think he'll be okay?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Tom hesitated, glancing at Dr. Harper, who stepped closer to speak. "He's a fighter, Emma," she said. "Everything we've done so far is helping him. Now it's up to Max to decide how much fight he has left. And from what I've seen, he's got plenty." Emma nodded, holding on to those words like a lifeline. She turned her attention back to Max, watching his chest rise and fall with a little more steadiness than before. The quiet rhythm was both soothing and nerve-wracking. Every breath felt like a victory, but the fear of what could go wrong lingered in the back of her mind. The morning passed slowly. Dr. Harper checked on Max every hour, adjusting his four and monitoring his vitals. Each time she came in, she offered Emma a reassuring nod, and Emma's heart lifted just a little more. Max stirred occasionally, his paws twitching in his sleep as though he were dreaming. Emma took those moments as signs that he was still with her, still fighting. By mid-afternoon, something remarkable happened. Max let out a soft whine and opened his eyes. Emma gasped, sitting up straight as she leaned over him. "Max, can you hear me?" she asked, her voice trembling with hope. Max's dark eyes met hers, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of recognition. His tail, which had been still for so long, gave the faintest wag. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send tears streaming down Emma's face. "He's waking up," she cried, looking over at Dr. Harper, who had just entered the room. The veterinarian smiled as she approached, checking Max's vitals. "This is a great sign," she said. "He's still weak, but waking up and responding to you is exactly what we were hoping for." Emma leaned down, her tears falling onto Max's fur as she whispered, "You did it, Max. You're so strong. I'm so proud of you." Max let out a soft, tired bark, his tail wagging a little more. He tried to lift his head, but the effort seemed too much, and he rested it back down. Still, the spark of life in his eyes was undeniable, and Emma's heart swelled with relief. Tom stepped forward, placing a hand on Emma's shoulder. "See? I told you he's a tough little guy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Over the next few hours, Max continued to show signs of improvement. Dr. Harper reduced the oxygen support, and Max began breathing on his own, though still with some effort. By evening, he was able to sit up with Emma's help, leaning against her as she gently stroked his back. "He's going to need time to recover fully," Dr. Harper explained. "He's been through a lot, and he'll need plenty of rest and care. But I'm confident he's going to pull through." Emma couldn't stop smiling. For the first time since the ordeal began, she allowed herself to believe that Max would be okay. She leaned down to kiss his head, whispering, "You're coming home, Max. We're going to take care of you, and you'll be running around the meadow again in no time." The drive home that evening felt entirely different from the drive to the clinic. Emma sat in the back seat with Max curled up beside her, his head resting on her lap. Tom glanced at them in the rearview mirror, his face soft with relief. When they arrived home, Emma carried Max inside, setting up a cozy bed for him near the fireplace. She stayed by his side all night, feeding him small bits of food and water and talking to him about all the adventures they would have once he was better. In the days that followed, Max slowly regained his strength. His walks were shorter, and he tired more easily, but his playful spirit began to shine through again. Each wag of his tail and bark of excitement felt like a miracle to Emma. She was careful to keep him away from the woods, though. The meadow was a safe place now, and she wanted to make sure he never faced danger like that again. One sunny morning, a week after the ordeal, Emma and Max walked to the edge of the meadow. Emma carried a small sapling, a young oak tree she and her father had chosen together. She planted it in a quiet spot near the tall grass, patting the soil firmly around its roots. "This is for you, Max," she said, smiling down at him, "to remind us of how brave you were and how much we love you." Max wagged his tail and barked softly, as if to say he understood. Together, they sat by the newly planted tree, watching the butterflies flit through the grass. The meadow felt alive with promise again, and Emma knew that as long as she had Max by her side, she could face anything.